Because I saw those different things. I'm gonna go get something to eat, but I want to see. If I can have to leave the box. Exactly. In fact, the leaf of those earlier ones here on end. Where do you want to sit? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Is that okay? Yeah. I'm gonna grab some. You sure you don't want any?
Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. I'm here representing the current president of Stimson, Brian Finley, who's out of town, but I'm really happy to resume a little bit of my old role of opening up wonderful conversations here at Stimson. I actually feel some loyalty to both institutions. I am happy to serve on the board of Georgetown's ISD and really think this topic is something that's of great, the topic we're going to talk about today is of interest to both institutions. Stimson started working on environmental issues more than a decade ago, and we did have a human security perspective fairly early on, looking at how countries of the global south were coping with water and other environmental stresses that for them were driving their own security agenda and security priorities really before that became such a common sense uh, judgment for the security agendas of the countries, the more advanced countries of the North, who think still in more hard security terms. But I think the conversation has evolved quite a bit. Stimson is now delighted to have Sally Yozell, most recently at the State Department, but a very fine environmental scholar and activist, running the environmental security program here today. And I look forward to hearing the views of our distinguished panel. And my great pleasure now is to introduce Ambassador
Great. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Great. I have a little bit of a cold, so bear with me on that and my voice today. But anyway, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming. What a great audience, and thank you for the kind introduction by both of you. So as noted, I'm the director of the Environmental Security Program here at Stimson, and I just want to start by congratulating Kelly for this very, very awesome, really awesome report. I mean, it really looks at climate change from a different level, really its impact on communities and the migration, and as Ambassador Bardeen said, not just focusing on the science, but really on the social impacts and what that means. And, it's an important area for all of us to think about as these communities migrate. I mean, environmental security, we are also thinking about this issue, our environmental security program, in the context of, what does it mean to the coast, for example? So as we see drought impacting terrestrial land areas and climate affecting people, they tend to be moving more towards the cities. Cities tend to be on the coast more often than not. And when you have that kind of combination of, what is climate doing to fishery resources plus overfishing, as well as distant water fleets coming in, for example, and exacerbating problems, that coupled with sea level rise and increased storms with the migration issue, what are the hotspots of tomorrow? What does it mean for security issues? And we're starting to think about this more, and certainly this report has been, what kicked us off in our thinking about that. I mean, thinking of Somalia, for example, where you have distant water fleets starting to ruin some of the fisheries there, and the huge drought that's going on pushing people. Suddenly we see an uptick in piracy, which we haven't seen in over 5 years. So that's an example of what this can turn into be, and I know Kelly's going to talk more about that. So we're absolutely thrilled to be here with Georgetown to co-host this, and let me introduce Kelly McFarland, who is our first speaker. Kelly is the Director of Programs and Research at the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown. He previously served with the State Department from 2009 to 2016 in the Office of the Historian, which is such cool. I love that. We have the historian and the geographer's offices. I mean, that's pretty neat. Rod is the Director of Health, Environment, and Natural Resources for the National Intelligence Council, known to us as the NIC. And prior to this position, he worked as a senior scientist for the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And then Anne, when she arrives, she's an adjunct professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and she too was at State Department serving as the Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Mitigation during the last administration. So we've got the former State Department team here. And so with that, let me just turn it over to Kelly to give us a good overview, and then we'll go into questions from myself and the audience.
All right. Thanks, Sally. I know we've had a lot of thanks so far, but I'd also like to add a quick thanks to my director, Barbara Bodine, and Ellen as well, for not only was she part of the working group, but provided a lot of aid to me as I was preparing to do working groups for the first time and writing background papers and whatnot. So she's been very helpful, and to Sally for helping put this panel together, and Jim here at Stimson as well. So, and just something to note as I get started here too is that this report is broad, and it is in part, as Sally noted, to be a starting point, to begin a discussion on issues that need to be looked at in much more detail in the coming years, because these are going to be an issue in the future. So Barbara talked a little bit about the background of the working groups and what the series is all about, so I'm going to jump just straight into the report itself and talk about that. But as we've noted, increasingly environmental shifts have profound implications for global patterns of settlement and mobility. Environmental changes shape patterns of human movement around the globe, and this includes both sudden displacement, think storms, flooding, that kind of thing, and also longer-term, more difficult to track, slow-onset migration. And they influence this and they shape this through their interaction with a number of different drivers. And one thing that we often get questioned about on this is how do you sort of quantify migration or environmental change as a driver of migration? And that, again, is something to be thought about in the coming years when more research is done on this, because it interacts with different drivers, whether that be economic, political, conflict. It's one of many differing drivers that push people to leave where they live. The key question that we sought to answer in this report was, what new policy tools do states and organizations, both individually and collectively, need to guide the most constructive forms of mobility and migration due to environmental changes in the future? We also focused mostly on longer-term, slow-onset migration. That was due to the fact that this is, again, the area that needs more study, needs more focus. In most places, when you have humanitarian disasters due to cyclones or storms or flooding, for the most part, we have ways to deal with that. We have disaster relief systems in place to deal with that kind of thing. Whereas for the slow onset migration, that's not the case. So that's why we decided to focus on that mostly in this report. To start with, Barbara noted that we didn't necessarily deal with the science of climate change or question it all in here, but we do need to deal with it in some ways when we define the challenges. And that's what we did at first, to kind of see where we could go from there. And we broke these into 3 different categories. The first was increased competition over natural resources make conditions ripe for wide-scale displacement. And there's a number of issues underlying this point. One is that there's a host of water-related issues to deal with. This ranges from water shortages, poor water quality, and floods that risk instability in the future and now. There's also rising temperatures in oceans. Think hydrological issues where fish that once were in a fishery are no longer in a fishery. This obviously affects people's livelihoods that go out and fish these areas for their income. So that's another issue with that. And then also increased instances of drought due to less rain in certain areas. And in many cases, a dwindling in resources can lead to conflict and migration. And we have a couple parts in here where we have little text boxes that go into a little bit more detail on certain areas. One of those is Fulani Herdsman. Many of you may not have heard of Fulani Herdsman before this, but it's a large group of herdsmen in the Sahel that are moving more and more into farm cropland of Nigeria, and this is causing conflict between them and farmers in Nigeria. Just in 2014 alone, to give you some numbers, 1,200 people were killed due to conflict between the two. And those of you who follow counterterrorism or Nigeria at all also know that this is the hotbed area for Boko Haram. So you have a lot of people that are already in conflict, a lot of people that are without a livelihood anymore. So this is a breeding ground for recruitment for Boko Haram also, which also points out, and one thing we note on in here is this issue between loss of resources, loss of livelihood, migration, and the potential for conflict, and that the IC, the intelligence community of the United States, and national security elements see climate change and the resulting migration as a national security issue. I'll leave that at that because I don't want to step on Rod's toes, because I know that's his wheelhouse and he's going to talk about that. So those fall under that category. The next category is extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense. Climate change is causing extreme weather events such as cyclones, storm surges, and a greater variability in rainfall, along with greater incidences of weather-related disruptions. Now, the question you get a lot of times is, there's always been storms. Well, yes, that's the case, but what we focused on is the aspect that there are more of them now, the frequency, and they're also stronger than they used to be. And one sort of easy example of this, and what we will probably face more of in the future, is Yemen in 2015. Yemen's a country that never had a typhoon, and most of you are probably aware that it's already facing a horrific humanitarian situation. In 2015, Yemen was hit with back-to-back typhoons for a country that's never even experienced one. So it's situations like this that just exacerbate a lot of the other humanitarian issues that are going on that make the situation so difficult, because they do destroy infrastructure, cropland, and again lead to that loss of livelihood that can push people to migrate to new areas. And then the third sort of challenge that we focused on was rising sea levels. And this is kind of speaks to itself. This causes increased flooding, submergence, and also saltwater intrusion into aquifers and deltas, and also coastal erosion of low-lying areas. This is particularly troubling for anybody that looks at a map these days and sees the fact that we are living in a world that has a high prevalence of littoral cities and mega-littoral cities. Meanwhile, a large proportion of migrants move to these areas to escape their own scarcity issues. And this is something that we kept coming back to within the report and within our discussions in the working group as well, is that not only do we have these large littoral megacities that are going to be in danger in many instances, but that's where a lot of these migrants are moving to, and a lot of new people are moving to, are these cities. And we also have some sections in here that discuss the Mekong Delta and the salinization of the Mekong Delta and the problems that's going to create in the coming future. And also Alaska and some cities that are already relocating in Alaska and the Pacific Islands. Some Pacific Islands are literally disappearing due to rising sea levels. A couple other things to think about and remember before we get into our ultimate guiding principles that we came up with. Is that the bulk of migration will be internal and or to cross-border or neighboring nations, which in turn is an issue because a lot of these places, because they're nearby, are also going to be facing some of these same climate issues. Another thing to keep in mind is that there is an urgent need for a coordinated approach to planning and response mechanisms. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a number of different groups, whether it be the U.S. government, the State Department, the UN, other governments out there, NGOs that aren't working on this. There are people looking into this, but one reoccurring theme in the working group from people in some of those organizations is that it needs to be coordinated better amongst these different organizations, so everybody knows what everybody's doing, basically. And also another thing to remember is that it's imperative that policymakers and others in the communities that are working on this keep both ends of the migration path in mind. And this is not just the outgoing communities, but also the receiving communities. Almost as important or as important as thinking about the outgoing community as well. And then finally, in one that Barbara mentioned, the timing of our working group. This one maybe becomes a little more important or sad, or however you want to look at it, whatever word you want to use. But another reoccurring theme that kept coming up is that many countries generally do not view issues related to the environment and human mobility as a Tier 1 priority. Although many governments consider mass refugee and migration flows critical issues, there's not that tie-in usually with the environmental side of things or migrants due to environmental change. This is an opportunity for governments throughout the world, for NGOs, for think tanks, for the international community to fill that void and work together to, one, define the problem, and then two, problem solve on strategies to mitigate the impacts of slow onset migration. And with that in mind, we did come up with 10 guiding principles. And again, they're guiding principles. We didn't, because of the size of this issue and the format of our working groups, we didn't delve really, really deeply into specific policy recommendations. There's some that are along those lines, but these are more broad guiding principles. So number one is to define environmental migrants. There is an issue and a host of legal, economic, and security reasons that we need to do this. In many instances, they're referred to as refugees, and for many of you that know that issue, that is an issue for political reasons and legal issues. The international community must work to create definitions for these people that are socially and legally acceptable to all. Number two is collect more data, and this is a major, major issue, and this is where places like ISD, where I'm from, where Stimson and other think tanks and international organizations will play a key role in the coming years, and that there's an urgent need for a coordinated push for real and usable data and new research. So, to answer such questions as which groups and societies are hit the hardest, what is the efficacy of resiliency interventions, how to assist vulnerable populations that may not be able to raise the funds to migrate. In many instances, the people that are hit the hardest are the people that actually can't move. How do we deal with that? How do we find these? And then also more research is needed on where people are leaving, are going to, and where they're coming from. or where we think they will be going in the future. Number 3 is to consider the advantages of planned relocation. We have a couple instances within the report where we talk about planned relocation, and it is something that's going on now. There's some Alaskan villages I talked about. The island of Kiribati in the Pacific has already purchased land in Fiji to relocate a lot of people. So that's going to be, this kept coming up again and again in the working groups as something that's probably going to be more likely in the future. That being said, as you can imagine, there's a host of issues that go along with planned relocation, basically moving an entire society. So there's going to need to be more study and thought process put into planned relocation and how we can use that to our benefit. Because, as you can imagine, it's better to think about these things and plan for it than it is to, at the last minute, decide you need to move, and then it's done on an ad hoc basis. So looking into planned relocation is going to be a big part of this in the future. Number 4 is make development assistance more adaptive. And again, we had development assistance folks in our working group, and they noted that in many instances, large-scale development projects in poorer nations and regions, once set in motion, are not necessarily adaptive to sudden environmental changes. In this case, national governments, NGOs, and international organizations can reframe and rethink the development planning process to reduce each project's potential risk from extreme weather events. Also, they can prioritize these projects, or those projects, designed to assist communities that are most threatened by climate change. Number 5 is create regional agreements. Dealing with some environmental-related problems on a regional basis, the working group thought, might help make these issues more workable. In many instances, external migration, migrants are likely to traverse multiple international boundaries with potential legal and security ramifications that go along with doing so. And at other times, people seeking to cross borders will obviously be hampered by other countries' regulations and policies. With this in mind, the working group suggested the creation of regional efforts that would allow for more fluid and workable migration. And with this in mind, somewhat brings us to number 6, which is to develop regional safety valves. Planning collectively for one nation or nations to serve as a safety valve for environmental migrants within a region would be a useful approach, somewhere for these people to go. This would allow for planning ahead of time, and also starting this early enough, as you can imagine, getting one country to be a safety valve obviously would be a difficult thing to do, but starting these sorts of things early on will give countries time and regions times to create workable incentives for these safety valve nations and get these things put in place. Number 7 is fairly straightforward, but more often than not isn't actually done, and that's to manage resources and infrastructure needs effectively. It goes without saying, with adequate management of water and land resources in normal times, some communities at risk may not have to actually leave. But this also goes into when we noted the fact that you also need to think of the follow-on communities as well. These sorts of places that are seeing an influx of people also have to start doing a better job of managing resources as well. Number 8, we should try the best we can to steer people where their needs can best be met. And again, this is where number 2 and the call for more research and usable data comes into play as well. Finding out where these people are going, finding out areas where they could use people with certain skill sets or certain backgrounds, and then trying to steer people to those places. Number 9 is focus on migrants' needs in receiving communities. Too often, countries perceive migrants as a burden on receiving communities, as you can open the news and see what's been going on in the last couple of years in Europe and see that. However, migrants can also provide highly valued labor, so we need to work to get receiving communities to focus on migrants' needs as well, which rolls into number 10, which is to prioritize the creation of jobs within receiving communities. Again, there are no easy fixes here. Many of these will be difficult and potentially need major political buy-in at both the national and regional levels. But starting earlier to research and plan for these issues will help when the time comes, which is why the working group recommended these principles and is pushing for groups and nations to look at these problems sooner rather than later. Because, as I said, when this slaps you in the face and you have to leave immediately, you have to come up with all of this on the fly. So planning ahead of time and starting this process now will make things a lot easier and more manageable in the future. And with that, I turn it back over to Sally.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive overview. I mean, the report really does bring out so many questions and so many areas for further study and research and action, really. So what I'm going to do, and Anne, by the way, welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to see
Sorry
you.
to be late.
That's okay. This is the team formerly known as State up here, so welcome. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump right into questions, and I'm going to sort of start at some of the high-level questions, and then we can narrow it down. So my first question is really general, but it's pretty pressing at this time, which is, in the wake of the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the Paris Accord and the proposed zeroing of budgets across the U.S. federal government related to climate change, who, whether it's in the United States or other countries or states or whatever, is likely to fill this void? Who's going to feel it the most? Some of the issues you've talked about, but who's going to be able to step in and take on some of the leadership role in our vacuum that we may be seeing? So that's for any of you.
I can quickly give a short answer to that. And where the working group and the working group report are concerned, I think that one good thing about this is that we didn't focus it just towards the U.S. government. So these aren't things that only the U.S. government can answer and do. These are things that NGOs can do, the international community can do, the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, all different organizations can look at this. Universities, individual researchers doing research and data collection in different areas. So it goes beyond just the national government, federal level. And also there's one, just to mention, one key player in this, and we have an appendix to the report that basically lists a lot of the current climate change migration initiatives, and it goes by government or international organizations. But the Nansen Initiative is a big one that looks specifically at climate-related migration. And they ended their first round of global consultations, and the U.S. was a partner or an observer to the Nansen Initiative. But it's now transformed into the Platform on Disaster Displacement. So that's one sort of outside organization that's looking at this closely.
So maybe I can jump in here because first off, let me say how nice it is to be back at Stimson. As a former board member, I had to stay away when I first got my job at the State Department, and now I'm back, although you moved in the meantime, but I've tracked you down and found you Stimson people. No, that would be a good excuse, but I didn't. In the State Department, working on refugees, political refugees, under the definition that was established in 1951 by the convention, it did not include environmental migrants. It included people who were fleeing because of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. They were being persecuted for that. And so that fits our understanding of the sort of Cold War refugees from Eastern Europe, if you think about it that way, or Cubans fleeing from Cuba to Florida. And it doesn't fit well for environmental migrants. And so what we saw was that bureaucrats, including myself, this is a full confession here, in the administration were so concerned about overloading the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, with additional unfunded mandates that we actually tried to prevent them from taking on environmental migrants as an additional responsibility. They were already so stretched by the large number of crises that were developing around the world over the past 5-8 years. And they also were dealing not just with the 21 million refugees who have crossed international borders, but also the 40 million plus internally displaced persons who were not part of the original mandate of UNHCR, and there was also pressure that UNHCR step forward and do more for those populations, which Antonio Guterres agreed to do, but UNHCR has always sort of had as a secondary priority, not their first priority. And so what we saw was Norway and Switzerland coming together to start the Nansen Initiative under guidance and participation of Walter Kalin, who's a former special representative, Secretary General for internally displaced persons. He's a Swiss jurist, he's an academic, he's been very successful in steering the Nansen Initiative. So initially we were outside of it. Special Envoy for Climate Change in the U.S., Todd Stern, came to us and said, you know, it looks like the U.S. is not supporting some of these far-sighted ideas, and could we please support the Nansen Initiative? Well, it turned out for the price of $1,000, you could become a friend of the Nansen Initiative. So that was the easiest thing we've ever joined, I think. And so we stopped being on the outside and we got on the inside. And what I tell my Georgetown students is, if you ever meet a Norwegian, definitely bring up Fridtjof Nansen, because he was an Arctic explorer, he was a scientist, he was the first High Commissioner for Refugees under the League of Nations, and he was a kind of a sexy guy. So I find that whenever I see Norwegians, if I bring up Nansen, they just really just light up. They're so thrilled. I used to keep a picture of him in my office, actually, so when Norwegians visited, and that worked well. So the Germans and the Bangladeshis have agreed to take on the successor to the Nansen Initiative, which, as you've just said, was the Platform on Disaster Displacement. And the Germans, and we know why, are now very, very interested in migration issues. And so the Bangladeshis hosted the Global Forum for Migration and Development, which is a gathering of states and migration experts, migration nerds. I hope none of you have ever heard of it. Well, Kathleen probably has. You were there, right? So that takes place every year, this gathering of states. And so Bangladesh hosted it last year, and the Germans were taking it very seriously and are hosting it this year. So this is, I think, where the leadership will come in.
As someone of the administration currently, I don't really necessarily want to talk about any perceived absence that has been created. But as someone who worked in the administration from Copenhagen, in the State Department, from Copenhagen to the Paris Accords and beyond, I would note that the real genius of the Paris Agreement was bringing these countries together and fostering an atmosphere where, instead of a top-down historic 20th century treaty, this is a bottom-up getting countries to commit to feasible, maybe a little beyond feasible, carbon emission reduction targets. And so I'm a physicist by training. I'll use my physicist analogy. It takes some amount of effort to get a ball rolling, but after it starts rolling, it takes very little to keep it going. And so that's how I see this, the climate accord progressing, at least over the next few years.
Great, thank you. And I think we've seen that in the recent response of cities and states and other countries. So thank you. Well, I'd like to sort of delve in a little further to sort of the definition and the terminology, because that's certainly something that you highlighted in the report. But in it related to Paris, the Paris Agreement, I don't think we came out of the Paris Agreement with a definite definition of what climate migrants or refugees were. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to be kind of hard to hone in on what that definition is. And I wonder if the reason it's been so difficult is it related to, particularly with regard to Paris, is it related to who would pay for this? Is it the polluter pay, or the ones most responsible for climate? Or where has that sort of missing element been to something that you've highlighted, or your team had highlighted as such an important area of trying to really identify a definition from, and I look across, because the definition seems to be important legally, financially, And what were you thinking in your report? Why was it so important to have a definition?
Well, I think from the standpoint of our report, I think it's getting some sort of definition then just it allows for the larger international community to view these people in the same way, and also can hopefully then allow for some sort of easier process through the whole thing, migrating between countries, not to the level of like a refugee, but something that still gives them some sort of legal capacity. I think what we saw as the major issue as far as trying to come up with a definition is the fact that it is hard to come up with who exactly is an environmental migrant because of the fact that there's other drivers involved in getting them to leave as well. For instance, we talk about it briefly in here, a couple sentences, but in 2010, if you're a rural Syrian and it's year 3 of the worst drought you've ever had in the region, or at least in modern memory, and you decide you can't do this anymore, so you need to move to the city. You move to the city, but then there's no jobs, and then the Arab Spring begins in January of 2011, and then you start in on protests and everything, and then eventually 3 years later you try to migrate. Are you a political refugee? Are you an environmental migrant? I mean, what are you? I mean, that's sort of the issue that we're dealing with here. And oftentimes it's a convergence of all of these different things. I mean, not obviously conflict all the time, but it's a convergence of these things that makes it difficult.
To my knowledge, climate refugee and climate environmental migrant, the status does not appear in the Paris discussions. I think that's narrowly focused on greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation, mitigation, and some, and you touched on it, some loss and damage part from extreme weather. But I don't know if they've ever gotten, I might be wrong, but to displaced people.
Yeah, looking at some of the UN documents and reports on this, they sort of have come together around climate as being a factor in complex crises, but not the single driving factor. And so that when you look at it that way, there's a long list of crises that can have a natural resource base that exacerbates situations so that it adds, sort of kindling to difficult situations. They talk about disputes and grievances over national resources can contribute to violent conflict when they overlap with other factors: ethnic polarization, high levels of inequity, poverty, injustice, and poor governance. A well-known example is Darfur, but Syria, and more people look at the drought from 2007 to 2010, and other crises, well-known crises. I mean, Rwanda had an issue of the collapse of the coffee crop, prices rather, and water issues in the Middle East. In Yemen, their failure to manage water resources and to undertake agricultural reform may also have exacerbated situation. So looking around the world, you find a natural resource piece of a lot of complex crises.
So would you therefore say it's not really, it hasn't been avoided because the concept of polluter pays? It's not taken into account. I mean, with responsibility. I know some countries would say that those who have created climate change should be the ones most responsible for paying for the effects of it on displaced persons. Is that a road and our global body should be going down, or is there a different direction?
It's a hard question. Those kinds of global governance structures seem to work better in the prior century. I'm veering outside of the lane of the U.S. intelligence community, but just as an observer, multilateral treaties seem harder and harder to do. I do want to jump on something that Anne said, and it's really, I think it's important to decouple climate from environmental issues. You do that in the report, but just for the sake of this discussion, I think it's really important. And the way that the intelligence community usually looks at this are these two forces coming down, one on habitat vulnerability. People forget climate change, put it aside for a second. People are increasing, population growth is going up, population is growing, and people are converging on the coasts. And even if climate change did not occur, or it stopped, the number of people growing on the coasts is still increasing the vulnerability of these habitats. Also, greater urbanization is having an effect on water resources, food, land, livestock, et cetera. So that habitat vulnerability is one driver. The second is environmental governance, and really environmental governance shortfalls. So deforestation, biodiversity loss, overpumping of groundwater. We could just bum everyone out just by talking about all the ways that humans and policies have not met the challenge of environmental governance. So those two things are a vice on many populations across the world. And then on top of that, you've got climate change. And it's not just an associated effect. So when I talk about climate change, I don't just mean temperature and sea level rise and ocean acidification. I also mean the linkages to ecological systems, disease, et cetera. And so when you put all of these things together, you get a really difficult problem to solve. And much of this has national security connotations and ramifications, which is why my community tends to look at it.
And this reminds me that more and more refugees do not live on a plane out in a remote area in a tented city. More and more refugees live in cities. In fact, the majority of refugees, like the majority of people, now live in cities. And where are cities? Many are along the coasts. And so, this is something that is very much current in humanitarian assistance circles right now, is trying to find refugees in the cities to which they've fled and get them the aid they need using newer techniques that are appropriate for a city, such as handing them an ATM card or giving them information through their cell phones, rather than to expect to distribute supplies to them when they line up in a camp.
And to take both of your points as well, I had it in here, but I didn't mention it, but just to speak to both of those points, a perfect example is Cyclone Mora from a couple weeks ago that wiped out a Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh. So just, recent examples in the news.
So that's really interesting. I mean, I think all of you have laid out some of the factors that are driving the problem, particularly on the coasts and urban areas. Well, as a global community, we can't be everywhere and help everyone. So if we had to try to figure out, using some of these factors you've highlighted, the prioritization, I think maybe, Rod, it could be for everyone, but it could be for you. What are the specific areas you focus on most to overlay, to identify the geographies where we should provide the biggest assistance, or focus most on our, even if it's the security issues, from your context, what are they and how do you go about that?
That's a delicate question because, not for any classification reason, it's because the intelligence community is part of the national security community. And so not every humanitarian issue is necessarily a national security issue. And there are other agencies in the government, NGOs, who are better suited to look at, humanitarian response I will say that increasingly the Department of Defense, not just increasingly, I mean it's way past increasing, is always called upon for humanitarian assistance because they have the know-how and the equipment to do so. So in some cases, humanitarian issues writ large become security issues when they bring in the U.S. military and perhaps strain our defense forces. But answering your question through the lens of national security, so I think it's wise to define what we mean by U.S. national security on occasion, and we generally think of threats to the U.S. homeland, threats to our allies, and events that degrade elements of U.S. national power, and that means economic, diplomatic, et cetera. And so we would tend to look, again, I'm hesitant to name exactly the regions. I don't want to leave out anyone. But nuclear states certainly rise to the level of places of concern, especially if, I'll just mention Pakistan. If we had adverse conditions in Pakistan, which is in a tense water sharing situation with India, if we had some conflict over resources that might be exacerbated by migration from the area, that would be of concern. I would also look at places with very high population densities where the potential for mass movement is large. And so the obvious case, the two big cases I can think of there are Lagos, Nigeria, which is just sitting on the coast. There's a desert coming down from the north, mixing groups that don't like each other very much. And then you have sea level rise and the sinking of the city. It's just a stew of problems. And then you also would mention Dhaka and other big cities in Bangladesh. The elevation and the potential for storm surges that would perhaps permanently displace some of those populations, I think, is of concern. And that's incomplete. But.
Okay. Well, let me ask Anne a question. I mean, you started out by saying that, environmental migration, migrants really not been part in the past of the definition of I think you said the High Seas UN. What's the name of the
UN High Commissioner for Refugees, right? UNHCR.
Thank you. If it were today, after having read this report and having been engaged with conversation, would you still have that same recommendation, or do you have thoughts on how in the future should it or should it not be included moving forward? And if yes, how? And if not, what route should be encouraged to?
Well, I think one issue with the UN is that it's so split up into so many silos right now, and we spend a lot of time talking about coordination across these different agencies. So it's hard with that background to say, oh, we need another agency. Mm-hmm. But the way the world is constructed right now, this population does fall between the cracks. It falls between the cracks in how national governments respond, and it falls between the cracks in how the international system responds beyond national governments. So I think if you were doing it de novo, you would perhaps address the plight of the people traveling and not focus in so narrowly on what has prompted them to flee. Because they look the same. I mean, that was and their experiences are often the same, no matter what the reason is that they've left a place. So whether you're an Eritrean fleeing mandatory conscription in Eritrea, or an Ethiopian with problems with the government, or South Sudanese who is fleeing ethnic violence. So, or someone from further afield who's just looking for a job opportunity or educational opportunities. By the time you get to North Africa and you're getting on that boat, you're having the same experience, and you're just as vulnerable to traffickers and unscrupulous smugglers and exploitation.
Any others? No.
Good point.
Yes, no, it's a very good point. So I guess, so that's kind of, you're talking about after the fact. So I guess let's think of proactive approach.
One thing that might be different if you wanted to be proactive is I think that when we went to this international conversations on migration and development, USAID did not come out in strength. And part of it was their response was the same to that as our response had been to other things. It's like we're stretched in a lot of different directions. We've got higher priorities. But then the Swedes, for example, brought their minister of migration and their minister of development. And they would co-host this event one year. So this is an example where for Americans, maybe it wasn't that big a deal, but for other countries, they took it very seriously and they staffed it at a much senior level. And what I found participating in these, not being a minister, but an assistant secretary, was the U.S. could have a tremendous amount of influence on what was said in these events, how nations thought about these issues, how important they took them. We didn't have to put in a lot to have a lot of influence, but we hadn't been putting in much. So I think both things are true. We can do more and get a bigger sort of bang for that. And in that way, we could potentially match what other governments are doing in terms of how seriously they're taking it and how much thought they're putting into these issues.
Rod, let me ask you a question. It sort of does go back to that kind of proactive, trying to create a situation where there's more resilience built into the system in advance instead of waiting for after the fact. You're a scientist and you're an ecologist. I mean, as you look around the places where you see conflict in the world and insecurity as a result of some of the climate and other environmental issues, do you think there's enough willpower globally or whatnot to just, try to be proactive and try to move things in the right direction before it becomes extreme?
Pass. I'm joking. So the intelligence community is very good at bringing the bad news. We don't really usually liven up the environment in a particular setting. I would say that resilience comes in many forms. Right? There's political resilience, there's human resilience, infrastructural resilience. Some of these are at odds with the way that we run the world. For example, efficiencies, economic efficiencies especially, tend to reduce the resilience of systems. So again, I'm a physicist by training. My background is in complex systems. I kind of see the world through this lens. But the way that we run our economic system tends to undercut resilience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's how we run the political side. And so the political side isn't efficient. And I would say that, who am I to say, speak to what the global appetite is for building resilience in war-torn nations. The citizen in me, not the government worker, hopes that it is strong. You can see donations, for example, Yemen, which is just going through a terrible time. There are the global community is assisting somewhat. My fear, to bring it all back down again, is that with the issues that I mentioned before, habitat vulnerability, environmental governance, and climate change, all those vectors are going the opposite direction, and they're combining. And so what we may see is, again, putting off a little bit, a condition where we have so many humanitarian crises or nuisances that we break the ability of the global community to address them, either politically or financially. So I think in the near term, yes. I think we have to change the way that we do local, regional, and global governance and assistance to really address the issues that are on their way in 10 to 15 years.
I feel a little guilty that I said something negative about AID, though I tried to say it as softly as possible. So I want to point out where AID was much stronger was in terms of resilience and focusing on resilience and working with other leading donors, development agency leaders on building resilience and engineering projects overseas to do that, meaning that countries would be better able to withstand shocks. One of the problems we have right now in Washington is that AID is just getting an administrator, and AID and state don't have people below that level leading bureaus, including my own former bureau. So while there's very capable, able people acting in those jobs, you don't have a team coming in that is empowered to really push for new and expansive policies and policy directions.
Well, let me ask a question about sort of building on that. I mean, so USAID and other entities in the development community, I mean, really, drought, famine, disaster relief have always sort of been in their bailiwick, as well as with the NGOs. But it's kind of overtaxed these groups, to say
Right.
the least. So when you think about, and I think Rod said a little bit at the beginning, that military and intel are more and more engaged in this, I guess the question is there a way to operationalize with the military response and the defense community more to support that kind of work that the aid community has been doing? I mean, is it operationalized? Could it be more operationalized? Where do we see that sort of going?
Well, can I quickly say kudos to the Defense Department for having focused on these issues ahead of other agencies, and also counter to the very unhelpful political debates over climate change. From the point of view of humanitarian professionals, there is definitely a desire not to have DoD wading into some of these complex conflicts to deliver humanitarian assistance. It is, got unparalleled ability to respond quickly and with a great deal of energy when natural disasters hit around the world. They just, no one else comes close, and so they do save a lot of lives when they're involved in, say, cyclone response. But when people are shooting at each other, it's not a good time to have the U.S. military sent in for humanitarian purposes, and that's where organizations that try to be impartial in how they distribute aid and neutral in how they're perceived, which is harder and harder to do. That is the principled approach that a lot of do-good NGOs, humanitarian NGOs, Red Cross movement pursue.
I'd just like to reiterate that as well. I think I'd be careful with sort of institutionalizing too much of this in the DoD realm. Again, as Ann noted, I think it's fine as far as a first responder sort of thing. I think they're really good at that and serve a useful purpose. But for sort of longer term, some of these issues where you need humanitarian assistance and to build sort of infrastructure, do those types of things, I think there's other organizations and arms of the government that are better suited for a host of reasons to do that kind of thing.
Should we go to? Oh, yes. I'm sorry. Look out at the audience. Okay, great. Thank you. I've been so impressed with who we have here. Without even, I apologize. So let's start with the audience. Yes, please. I apologize.
Kathleen Newland from the Migration Policy Institute. And I just wanted to point out, I think one of the big breakthroughs in the Paris Agreement and in the international discussions generally has been attention to migration, not just as a driver of displacement, but as an adaptation to the conditions that drive people. And I think it was in the Paris Accords that we had for the first time that recognition that mobility could be part of the solution as well as part of the problem. And I think that gives an opening for different institutions, both international and national, to get more involved with these issues. Two other quick points. A lot of the action on these issues now for coping with displacement is happening at the local level. When there's a sort of void at the international and national levels, it's the mayors of these big cities who are being forced to cope with these influxes and are sort of banding together to share experiences and good practices and create a sort of lobby for more attention to the consequences of displacement where it lands, where the rubber meets the road. And there is just final point, there is an effort going on right now that I think could end up being quite important, which started last September, big UN summit on large movements of people that has led to a negotiated process to produce a global compact on migration. And that could end up filling some of this void for those people who are left out of the refugee definition. There will be a global compact on refugees, but it will be more narrowly focused on existing definitions. But the compact on migration has some potential to address these larger issues. Thanks.
Hi, thank you all for a great report and good comments. I'm Johanna Mendelson, foreman at the Stimson Center. I wanted to build out on something you said, though, about the role of the military because in these humanitarian disasters, because one of the things that's becoming clear, and I think a NIC report, which I didn't see cited on food security, basically lays out that issue as a threat for the U.S. military to address. And it seems with the asymmetrical budget, which probably will get worse in the terms of the development community, is it realistic not to begin to think about a broader dialogue about what equities the DoD brings to the table aside from the quick airlift and putting troops on the ground, and some of the prevention components such as on-the-ground observation of special operators or some of the other things that they do where it could inform the development community in a way which we don't naturally think about them first. I'm hosting, I have a selfish interest. I'm hosting a seminar here about the role of the military in food security in July, and I think that this is a concern that I think, Ann, you articulated and know well as we've been in these fields. But what is the reality of this happening? And at the command level, at least at a tactical basis, how much planning is going on in this sense?
It's a really good point. I think it's a really important thing to bring up. I'm not certain I can speak to the DoD's appetite for another expansion of their mission, unless they don't see it as an expansion of the mission. In fact, my interaction, I'm married to someone who worked at the Department of Defense, is that they're not excited about expansion of efforts and expectations. They're pretty well stretched. Again, folding it into existing, especially if you can really bring in ideas of instability and migration potential, I think that there's a way to slide it into existing work.
So I have two thoughts about this. And, contrary to Johanna, your constructive, upbeat, positive, it's very characteristic of you. Look what we could do to fix this. I, of course, retreat back into my beaten down post-administration outlook, which is, one of the biggest issues, not the biggest, but a big issue that you can't underestimate is the constant turnover of personnel between NGO aid workers, foreign service officers, and the military in these places. And so there has been, for years now, a lot of good work done to get, good cooperation into doctrine of how to work together in difficult locations. But it seems we're never done with that training. We're never done with that conversation, because as soon as you've got somebody who really feels comfortable in the Pentagon, understanding how, what the good uses of the military assets are and what the limitations are in these complicated places, that person moves on and someone comes in and they've got a lot of people with a lot of energy and a lot of clout and resources, but they haven't been sensitized to what works and what doesn't work. And so that, I think, how to disseminate the best thinking on this continues to be really, really challenging, I think, in all the communities that work in these locations overseas where there are complex crises, or in the U.S. with, for example, Katrina or Sandy or things like that. I had a second point, but now I've forgotten it.
Yes, Ellen, and then one over there, and then after.
So just in the spirit of trying to think of, how to make lemonade out of these circumstances, I've always thought that Canada and Russia should benefit from climate change in the sense that, they might be declining, in the case of Russia, certainly declining population, vast open space. Do we see any countries of the North actually wanting climate migrants, and sort of preparing for, and I know Europe feels that it's crowded and they don't really have room and there's cultural and political sensitivities, but is there any planning by key countries that have this open space to try to be proactive? Any examples of that?
Other than what we've seen in the news with Canada, I haven't seen anything. But others might know more than I do on this. Well, just other than what you've seen with
being open to Syrian
refugees and that kind of thing. Yeah.
I would also, this is outside my lane, but the United States is a open country as well, with a lot of land, especially up in Minnesota, North Dakota, that type. But.
I haven't specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised economically as that would be the case. It seems to make sense.
And
right?
I think, so one of the reports that my group at the NIC puts out is something called Global Trends that just came out in the last few months. And part of that, and it was written by one of my colleagues, part of that identifies, just for lack of a better term, a demographic time bomb that is facing a lot of the developed world. So the rich countries are aging very quickly, and the median working age is rising. At some point, that becomes unsustainable. And so you can imagine migration policies changing as those domestic pressures are felt. And so we're talking about China, we're talking about Russia, we're talking about Japan, we're talking about most of the West. The United States seems to be less vulnerable to this trend because of our historic migration policies, immigration policies. But I think that part, what's going on domestically is a piece of the entire migration discussion.
I guess one of the things that, one of the messages we tried to get out in a lot of our conversations about migration in the bureau I used to lead over the last several years was that migration does not have to be a dirty word. Migration can be a very positive experience, but it tends to get covered and discussed more so as, poor, vulnerable, exploited people, and then on the flip side, a menace headed towards the Northern Hemisphere. And so that does not have to be, there is a lot of positive experience, both for the migrants and for the receiving countries, that's happening out there. It's just not covered with the same breathless, excited tones.
Yeah, and I'd like to reiterate that as well. I mean, there's times when our report makes for some fairly depressing reading, but at the same time, we try to get across as well that there are ways that this has been a positive effect, and there's ways that you can do this in a positive fashion moving forward. And that's part of that starts with planning for these things now and doing the research and data compilation now. And one other sort of just a marketing thing for even though I'm no longer in the intelligence community, I will plug the intelligence community and say that the report Rod did, we quote in here too, the national security implications of climate change, and the global trends report he just mentioned. These are all unclassified reports. So if you aren't familiar with the NIC or their reports, go online and look at these and take a look at what they're good stuff.
My name is not formally attached to this document.
Well, yes.
So.
There's a woman in the back there who's had her hand up. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Divya. I'm currently an intern at PILPG. I'm actually currently working on a paper regarding this very topic. So I'm very interested, and I kind of came across the same problems in terms of how complex the definition is for a climate migrant or an environmental migrant. And in fact, in 2012 or 2013, New Zealand was the first to reject a case for Te Tiota from Kiribati regarding the same issues with the UNHCR and the definition in the Refugee Convention. Given that we have a lot of migrants who will be coming from countries like Kiribati, Tuvalu, Maldives, which will at one point be completely submerged underwater, I'm curious as to what you think is the scope for bilateral agreements between countries. I know in 2008, the Maldives did try having a land agreement with India that hasn't actually gone through, but this is also another way that people are trying to come up with another solution. So my question really is, do you think we need more of a refugee-like convention or something that, do you think a bilateral agreement could work and could be internationally recognized to move a large population of migrants at once? Thank you.
I think that the timing is everything. And with the exception of Canada, the countries that could benefit the most from migrants and have also been traditionally resettlement locations for refugees are all now having domestic issues with bringing people in. And so what we need is, remember you heard it here first, peace on earth to spread and to stop having these conflicts that produce so much displacement. And if we could get some wins from our diplomats, and then, which is just much easier said than done, and so that people could go home again and the numbers could come down, I think then these overburdened institutions could start thinking more creatively, and also governments could be more open to some kind of bilateral discussions, perhaps. So it's not a bad idea, but I think the timing is off. I have the distinct honor for having signed the U.S. deal with the Australians, which the president has called dumb, worst deal ever. But he's called a few other deals worst deals ever too. Yeah, so so even Australia, which is a neighbor to all these South Pacific countries, I mean, their domestic discussions on this stuff are very, very dicey right now. So you don't have a lot of really good performers besides Canada. You know, we talked to the Japanese about taking in refugees as part of the Leaders Summit that President Obama had last September, and they just are such a homogenous society. They are very, very resistant to offering some kind of permanent resettlement, you know, and much more comfortable with funding things overseas. So there's not a lot of movement on these things from what I was able to see right now.
And if I can add, this is one of the very first questions that I tried to focus on when I was in the State Department. Not this particular question, but it's the question of, and you alluded to it when you were talking about Tuvalu, was it? If a country moves wholesale to a new country, right, and it's a good bilateral agreement and that all works, there's still some legal issues of sovereignty. Just narrowly, what happens to their UN vote, for example? Are they still an independent nation? I mean, we've seen past examples where that got thorny. I'm partly descended from Native Americans in the United States. That didn't go so well for sovereignty for that. So, you know, I think, you know, in the 21st century, I think there's perhaps hope of doing this, but I think there are some thorny legal issues that we probably haven't thought through.
Yes.
Hardest question in the room.
David Mickle, non-resident fellow with the Stimson Center. First, just a quick comment on the distinction between climate change and other environmental and governance stresses. Rod's my friend, so I'm in complete agreement with what he said. And I think it's important analytically to make those distinctions between climate pressures, other environmental pressures, failures of governance, weak capacity. But conceptually, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the interconnections, particularly in our present environment where we are politically skittish about evoking climate change. And its connections with these other issues, because it seems to be a little bit like, you know, metaphorically, to be looking at road accidents and to say, well, no, it's not that the road was slippery, it's that the driver was sleepy, the brakes weren't good, the shocks were not as strong as they should be, and so therefore the accident, it's the car and not the road. But the road is getting slipperier and slipperier, and we're not all driving Range Rovers on a closed course with, you know, a professional driver, and so we risk kind of distracting ourselves from an important part of the equation if we, you know, harp too much on that distinction when we should be, you know, being mindful of the links. But my question goes to, and this isn't for you, Rod, directly so, is the list of recommendations. I wonder if you could walk me through a little bit the thinking about the politics of that list of recommendations, particularly the second half, because, you know, I know recommendation like, well, if we could direct people towards a country that needs them, and we've just talked a little bit about which countries that might be, but the skills and capacities and desires of the migrant population might not actually match with the needs of the country that we say needs those refugees, and the host population, the domestic population of that country that we are saying needs refugees, like a Japan, or might not feel that they actually do need this migrant population. You know, likewise, building up job capacity in a receiving country. What's the domestic politics of saying, look, we want to enhance your job growth potential, but part of the reason we're doing so is so that you can accommodate environmental migrants. So, and if we are building up a domestic job capacity in a host country, how does that play with the politics of maintaining the resilience of the sending country? I mean, one of the factors of resilience in a state or a community suffering from environmental stresses is their human resources, their, you know, professional capacities, the folks there who can run and manage the institutions that allow them to be resilient. If we're now creating, you know, a an incentive for them to move to Japan or Korea or Canada where they're needed, then aren't we draining the resiliency capacity of that vulnerable country that's actually most likely to be struck by the environmental pressure?
So a couple points on this, and it's a great question, obviously. But so the nature of the working group, we weren't able to dive really deeply into a lot of issues. So that's why it was more guiding principles as opposed to straight, really strict, specific recommendations. But to answer your question, I would say that personally, if I look at any one recommendation to me that stands out more than any other that I think fits in with all of the other 9 recommendations, it is the notion of doing more research and collecting more data on this issue and how it works in receiving communities that people are leaving from, how resiliency works, how it doesn't work, how you deal with that issue you just talked about. Like, well, if you're creating jobs in this area for migrants, then what does that mean for those people that are doing the resiliency back in the leaving community? So, I mean, that's why, and again, this focus on, we have to focus on both. It's not just where they're going or where they're coming from. It's both of these. We have to think about the holistic approach to this. And again, as far as, you also mentioned, you have these migrants with these skills, and you're going to push them to this place, but what if those skills don't fit in with that place you're pushing them to? Again, this all goes back to the research and data accumulation that needs to be done so that we can figure these things out to the best that we're able to do that. But I think it all goes hand in hand in my book. The research, you don't want to just start sending people someplace because you think that that's going to be their best fit. We need to have hard quantifiable data that shows that, actually this is where these people should go. No, that's where they should go. And again, like we said, this isn't an easy fix. And there is going to be, political issues involved with this. If you start building, creating jobs for migrants in places where there aren't jobs for the people that are already citizens of the communities, that's an issue. And that's something that governments just aren't going to do. We're seeing that in Europe now, whether or not that is the case with jobs or not. At least just the fear of it alone, of the loss of jobs because of migrants, is driving a lot of the politics and what we're seeing in Europe now. So, these are long-term things that we need to get our heads around and start planning for and thinking about now. And that's why we, came out with this report. I guess that's a long way of saying I don't know a specific answer to your question, but I think it all ties back into the need for more research and more data on this specific issue of migration and how it relates to climate change, environmental change.
So, being mindful of the time, I'm going to have to, I think, cut it off at this point. But I think if you haven't all read the report, I really urge you to do so. And those areas that are highlighted as the principles and the recommendations, I think almost each one of them could be a new research project in it amongst itself. So let me ask Kelly, let me just ask you one closing question. Is this something that you and your team are going to delve into, or looking to others to work with? I mean, what are the next steps now that you've come up with such a great report that is highlighting some of these issues?
So I think the Global Commons working group that we're doing has a different topic every semester, so we've moved on from this, which was the fall topic. But I think we had an on-campus rollout in April. We had this event. I'm going to a conference in September to talk about it again. I'm turning this into a journal article in the next couple of months again. So I think there's going to be some ongoing work on this and involved with this coming forward beyond just the report here. So.
Okay. Well, let me say thank you very much to our very distinguished panelists, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Stimson.